Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be discussing how you can invest in Israel to beat the BDS. Warm welcome to the programme, and I have two very special guests on the programme, one from the UK and one from Israel. Firstly, I'll introduce you, Arnon Perman, and you are the International Director of Israel Bonds.
Pleasure being here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the programme, as well as Joe Ozer, who also works for Israeli Bonds UK. So, Arnon, I'll start off with you. Can you share something about your Jewish background, being brought up in Israel, and your incredible career that spans politics, that spans diplomacy, and now business?
My great-grandfather first came to Israel on the eve of Yom Kippur, 1882.
Amazing.
That's when my family first time entered Israel. Ever since, I think it's 7th generation or 8th generation, we've been in Israel. I was born in Israel. I served in the army for close to 5 years in the Israeli Navy. I've served, as you said, in politics or in public service, diplomacy, and now I'm fortunate enough to be working in Israel Bonds and living in London.
Fantastic. And also, before the programme, you were sharing that you had your own political TV programme.
Yep.
From the Israeli Knesset.
Called The Submarine.
Fantastic. Can you share a little bit about that programme?
Yeah, we came up with the concept. Submarine is the nickname of the inner team of a politician in Israel. This is the 5 to 6 people who consult, who are with the politician every step of the way. So we imitated this kind of a team. We gathered together a group of consultants on a television show, and each show we picked up a different politician. We did a survey, a poll for this politician, and we gave him the best advice that we can, every time for a different one. It can be the Prime Minister, the ministers, Knesset members, high-ranking officials, and it still is running. I'm here, but it still is running. It ran for 4 years, I think, with me, and now somebody else is doing it. And it was more than everything fun, because it was dealing with fun issues.
Excellent. I love the concept. And Joe, an absolute pleasure to have you on the Middle East Report. Do you want to share something about your Jewish background, being brought up here in the UK?
Yeah, well, I was born in London. I wasn't, unfortunately, wasn't able to live in Israel. But I grew up in Swiss Cottage, went to school in Jewish schools in London, and then studied biology at university, which led me to a career in finance.
How does that work?
as obviously as the natural progression. And then that's eventually brought me to be very lucky to be the director of the UK for Israel Bonds.
Fantastic. And what does it mean for you then, working for an Israeli company, knowing that that's investing in Israel for you?
So for me, the reason that I joined Israel Bonds was because it was very important for me to continue my career in finance, but it also gave me a chance to give back to Israel, which is the country my father grew up in. It was the country that I'd gone to visit every year for, the summer every year, and it was a way to not just be one of those fat cats that work in the city, but have a little bit of altruism towards my life in a way that also benefits me, like, career-wise.
Excellent. And Arnon, you served as the media spokesman for the late Ariel Sharon, one of Israel's great warrior prime ministers and generals. What was the great man like, and can you share some stories of working with Ariel Sharon?
I was fortunate enough to work with Prime Minister Sharon for several years when he was Prime Minister. I was his head of media and communication division and his personal media advisor. I'm always saying there's not a day in my life that passes that I don't remember something about the Prime Minister, something that went on, some lesson that I was taught. And one of the stories I remember was, I think it was 2001 or 2002. Those were the days where you'd wake up in the morning, you didn't ask if, You ask when, where, and how many casualties are going to be because of a suicide terror attack. And there was a horrible terror attack in Jerusalem. And the Prime Minister, even though it was an unsecured scene, decided to go and see and visit the scene. And there were 23, if I remember correctly, body bags lying on the floor because a suicide bomber went on a bus full of kids and exploded. And it was a horrible sight. And we went there together. I drove with him. And then we came back to the Prime Minister's office. And he was silent throughout the way. And it's not typical for him. And when we came to the office, he went to his room. And then he called me after a couple of minutes. And I remember distinctly him saying that there's some sort of a heroism dying in battle. When you fight and when you go to war, because you have to go to war, there's some sort of a heroism dying in battle because that's your profession, that what you should do. This is a useless death. This is more horrible than anything because these are 23 body bags on the floor. It was really hard on him. And I think that being a prime minister, him and every prime minister, by the way, the current one is not different, the one before him is not different, is the responsibility that comes with this position, which sometimes it's literally life and death decisions, and sometimes it's going to thank God, not today, but then going to places like this and looking at that, and it was, I saw the influence on him, and I saw what it did to him, and I saw how he took it. He was 75 then, or close to 75. He served, you know, in the wars, and in Yom Kippur War, in the military. He was in almost every capacity as a minister. Then he became prime minister, and it was, you know, it sat on him, and his reaction was true sadness. Sadness for the particular people who lost their lives, and sadness as the leader of the Jewish state, that's what's happening there.
Incredible, thank you. So let's have a look now, this excellent CBN report that looks at the legacy of the late Ariel Sharon.
His stroke took him down at the height of his power, but Sharon's legacy lives on in Israel, for better and for worse. Older generations remember him as the brilliant and daring general with the swagger, hero of the desert in Israel's 3 major wars from 1948 to 1973. But he also became a symbol of Israel's occupation of Lebanon in 1982. And as prime minister in 2005, he led a deeply divisive campaign to uproot thousands of Jewish residents of the Gaza Strip. It was done in the name of peace. But Sharon missed the years of rocket attacks on Israel and that Hamas takeover of Gaza that followed the pullout. Sharon believed Jews had a right to visit their holiest site on Jerusalem's Temple Mount. But when he went there in 2000, the Palestinians launched a second violent uprising, or intifada. Israelis elected him prime minister just a few months later.
He was the last prime minister that actually fought in our war of independence when Israel regained its independence and sovereignty back in 1948.
Sharon was one of modern Israel's most popular prime ministers. His battlefield exploits earned him the name the Bulldozer. Sharon began his career as a fighter in the Haganah, the Jewish underground army, and he fought in Israel's 1948 War of Independence. In the 1967 Six-Day War, his lightning moves against Egypt and the Sinai helped Israel triple the territory it controlled, almost overnight. In 1973, with Israel in desperate straits after it was attacked on the holy day of Yom Kippur, Sharon's bold maneuver trapped the Egyptian Third Army and turned the tide of the war. But in Israel's next war, Lebanon in 1982, Sharon was disgraced. Many blamed him for failing to prevent a massacre of Palestinians in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. He resigned as defense minister, but stayed in the mainstream of Israeli political life. He also helped mastermind the Jewish settlement building in Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip, seizing on their strategic value.
All those communities that we built in Judea, Samaria, Gaza district, the Golan Heights, They are not obstacle to peace. They are obstacle to war.
His legacy will be of great leadership. He was very, very proud of his Jewishness. He was very proud of Jewish history. He felt the responsibility for the Jewish people and the Jewish history and the reconnection of the Jews to their land.
His commitment to the settlements was so strong that many Israelis were stunned when Sharon proposed and then completed his controversial plan to evacuate Jews from the Gaza Strip. As the leader known as Arik is laid to rest, Israel is surrounded by unstable enemies on nearly every side. But the Jewish state is stronger than ever, and millions of Israelis know that is due, in some measure, to Ariel Sharon. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And that's in tribute to the great man himself, Ariel Sharon. Joe, we're now talking about Israeli bonds. I think it was important to discuss Ariel Sharon and Arnon's connection with him. But in terms of Israeli bonds, can you tell us what they are and the historical origins of Israel bonds?
Of course. In 1951, David Ben-Gurion went to the American diaspora. I believe there was a conference in Madison Square Gardens or somewhere in New York, and he was very grateful for the charity work that people were bestowing on the brand new country. But then he said to those people that came to him, we really need your investment as well. And there became the start of Israel bonds. Today, Israel bonds are sovereign government bonds that are issued by the State of Israel, which are sold mostly to the retail general public, from anywhere from £100 all the way up to whatever someone would like to invest. And it's generally used from anything from a gift all the way to something to put into their retirement planning and their pensions. The bond itself is an instrument that you effectively are loaning money to the government of Israel, and then after a set amount of time, you will receive interest, or you will receive all your money back. Plus interest depends on which product you purchase and which repayment vehicle that is built into that product.
And Arnon, can you share with us the impact that Israeli bonds have had since they were introduced, nearly coming up for 70 years?
Now, I think everything that happens in Israel since 70 years ago, almost 70 years ago, when Israel bonds was established, has to do with Israel bonds. Because in the times where Israel bonds were established, the state of Israel, the economical state of the state of Israel was very bad. The state was just established, was just built. We waged war, or war was waged against us by six Arab nations. So every money that was invested via Israel bonds was used for everything that was done in Israel. The money goes to the general budget, whether the government decides to build roads, whether the government decides to build hospitals or schools. It was part of the general budget. So everything the government did, Israel bonds had an effect on, not specifically, but generally everything the government decides. Thank God, fast forward 70 years ago, the situation, the economic situation of the State of Israel is one of the best in the world. If you look at every rating agencies, the money that Israel bonds raises, in the people who invest in Israel bonds, the money still goes to the general budget of the State of Israel and is being used in any way and form the State of Israel or the government of the State of Israel decides. It can be education, it can be funds, it can be high-tech, whatever is the locomotive that drives the Israeli economy today. So there's been a lot of changes in Israel and in Israel's economy for good in the last 70 years. But Israel bonds is a constant of people investing money into Israel, Israeli government, general budget, and the Israeli government decides where does it take this huge ship called the State of Israel. And thank God, so far the decision has been good.
Excellent. So let's have a look now at Israeli bonds.
Determined, forward-thinking, dynamic. This is today's Israel. a nation more than 70 years strong, Israel has surmounted seemingly impossible odds to become a world leader in virtually every field of human endeavour. This extraordinary success began May 14, 1948, when David Ben-Gurion declared, "The State of Israel has arisen." 3 years later, in New York, Ben-Gurion made another dramatic announcement, Israel Bonds. His visionary initiative for a global economic partnership with Israel had begun. Since that defining moment, advocates of the Jewish state on 3 continents have purchased Israel bonds in solidarity for portfolios and retirement plans, in celebration of life events, and as donations to favourite causes, amounting to totals exceeding $41 billion. Israel bond investors can be found everywhere. Synagogues, boardrooms, institutions and Jewish organisations, and amongst a new generation making their own imprint on Israel's future. Warren Buffett, the world's most renowned investor and a proud Israel bond owner, proclaimed Israel bonds to be a deserved endorsement of a remarkable country. For decades, Israel bond supporters have expressed their admiration for Israel's achievements through investments ranging from £100, US dollars and euros to several millions. Whether bought via israelbondsintl.com or calling the office directly, individual and institutional investors alike demonstrate pride in a nation that has turned a barren desert green, cemented its stature as cutting-edge technology leader, welcomed over 3 million immigrants from nearly 100 countries, produced 12 Nobel Prize laureates, and dispatched first responders throughout the world delivering critical humanitarian aid. Since 1951, this evolutionary journey has personally touched every Israel bond holder. A cornerstone of Israel's development, Israel bond sales exceed $1 billion annually, a catalyst for one of the world's most robust, resilient economies. This has been applauded not only by Israel's government, but ratings agencies as well. In November 2017, Fitch cited, quote, an active diaspora bond program in affirming its positive outlook for Israel. From agricultural beginnings centered on the Jaffa orange, Israel's economy is now grounded in innovative technology. Over 300 multinational companies have research and development centers in Israel, and thousands of startups are turning last year's science fiction into this year's reality. Collectively, Israel bond investors comprise a global network of stakeholders in a nation saving lives and transforming the world day after day. From inception, Israel bonds have exemplified l'dor v'dor from generation to generation. Legendary President Simon Barrett praised this historic enterprise, observing, the strong ties between Israel bonds and the State of Israel have been as resilient and fruitful as the land of Israel itself. Perpetuating Ben-Gurion's promise, investing in Israel bonds will continue to be a meaningful bridge to a Jewish homeland, rooted in thousands of years of spirituality, while embracing the infinite possibilities of tomorrow. Continue the legacy. Secure Israel's future by investing in Israel bonds.
And that gives you a great overview of Israel bonds and the impact that your financial investment can have in the nation of Israel. Joe, now, there is something that, as a Christian, that we are very much affected by, and that's a chapter in Genesis called chapter 12, where God speaks to Abram. And he says that I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you. And being a broadcast journalist, I've seen this constantly throughout history and in the news. What does it mean for a Christian to actually invest in Israel by buying Israel bonds?
I mean, speaking as a Jew, it's very difficult for me to speak to the country as to how it means to Christians, but I can tell you that we have lots of Christian clients who find it very, very special. They have a true desire to invest in the state of Israel. They have a true desire to really push the country forward. We look at it in a similar way to when someone invests in a company. Their natural thought process is that they want this company to succeed because they've got an investment in it, so they are truly, even for their own gain, invested in its success. So they go and they tell their friends, and they tell their friends that they want, they think that that person should also invest. We find that the Christian community really does get behind our message, they get behind our product, and they see it as a true link and a true bond with the state of Israel, because that is actually what it has been invented for, not just for the financial gain of the person who's investing and for the financial benefit of the state of Israel, but actually also to give a full bond to the investors, to the state, which is one of the reasons why we have what we call a lay leadership, a voluntary council of people who would like to help us spread the word, spread our message. And we recently have started a Christian council as well, which is headed up by a very dear friend of ours of the company called Barbara Dingle, who I'm sure you're very aware of who she is.
And so the viewers as well with
exactly,
with
I can imagine.
And I think Barbara and other people and to follow up on what Joe said, I think the word bond here is much bigger than an investment. As Joe said, you can invest, and people do invest in many companies, in the open market, private, public, doesn't matter, and they buy bonds. But the word bond, when it comes to Israel bonds, have another meaning, which is really the link, the connection to the state of Israel, being a Jew or non-Jew, or Christian, or the link to the state of Israel. You've been there many, many times, you're going again, and you know how unique it is. You know how you feel when you first step in Jerusalem, in Israel in general, in Jerusalem. So this link, this bond with the state of Israel, this investment into the state of Israel creates the link, and it's a link that lasts. It can last a year, it can last 15 years, it should last throughout your life. And that's the link we're talking about, and that's the bond that Israel bonds represents.
Amazing, you said that very well, Onan. And Joe, how much is Israel bonds worth to the Israeli government and its annual budget?
To put a monetary figure on it, Israel bonds has produced for the state of Israel over $1 billion a year for the last few years. And that is a lot of money, but more than that, Israel bonds to the state of Israel, to the government of Israel, is a direct link to communities around the world. So we operate in America, in Canada. We have clients in Mexico, Brazil. At the moment, we passport all of our permissions to the whole of the European Union as well. So we have clients that are literally all across the globe, and these are all people who are basically taken a stand and said, we are friends of the state of Israel. We say no to BDS. We want to invest our funds as part of our feelings towards the state of Israel, but also as part of the feelings towards our own pockets. So yeah, it's one of those sort of double-edged, not sword, but double-edged things that you get the good feeling, but you also get the returns that your financial advisor would appreciate and your reverend would appreciate. So you're towing the line of doing something that is for you and for the state of Israel, and Israel is appreciative knowing who their friends are. I think one of the key aspects of an Israel bond is that when you buy it, you hold it until maturity. You can't then go and sell it on. There isn't a secondary market, which is what most people that buy products on the open markets buy on, is called a secondary market. The primary market is when the bonds are first issued. So the Israel bond product is always a primary bond issuance, and there's one every 2 weeks. So that's where you get the changes in interest rates and things like that. However, when you purchase it, it's fixed, and it will always be that same bond from day one till day that it ends, be it, as Arnon said, a year or 15 years, depending on currency that you'd like to buy in, or length of time, or the product itself. But essentially, the State of Israel knows that is their bond with that client of ours, but that bondholder is tied to the State of Israel, and for them that's worth a lot.
In today, if to continue, Joe, in today's world, BDS, any anti-Israel movement, when you buy an Israel bonds, you make a decision. You take a stand. You're saying, I support the State of Israel. Be it £100 or £100 million, I support the State of Israel. And then when you invest, you sort of, and I'll use the old words of old people, you write the check to the State of Israel. And when you get the proceeds, you get the proceeds from the State of Israel. And you know what? As an Israeli and as a Jew, it makes me proud that people, like me, like Jewish Christian, has in their bank account, in their bank statement, received from the State of Israel. And that means something, because you make a stand by supporting the State of Israel. You make a moral stand, a financial decision, and this is my decision. I support the State of Israel. No matter what people say, that's my moral decision. Nothing beats that. Nothing is more important than that.
And Arnon, how much is Israel bonds financial lifeline to Israel? Because we know that Israel faces so many external threats from Iran, from the threats of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Israel lives in the toughest, most dangerous region of the world. And
we do live in a rough neighborhood.
Absolutely, yeah. Which means that so much of Israel's GDP is actually spent on its defense budget. So how much of a critical lifeline is Israel bonds to the overall running of the State of Israel?
It was, in the beginning, much more, because the economic state of Israel was different. It is today, thank God, much smaller part of the budget, because we are a very progressed, advanced, successful economy. But as you said, we live in a rough neighborhood. And in the Middle East, there's always a chance that something would happen. You don't ask if, you ask, as you said, when something might happen. Not even related specifically to Israel, but the turmoil around the Arab Spring. Everything has an effect on the State of Israel, and everything in the end has an effect on the budget of the State of Israel. So even though, like a cyclical, it's maybe today the specific effect is less, but it is an essential part of the budget of the State of Israel. And it always is, and it always will be, when times are good, and God forbid, if times are bad. It is always a pillar, as Joe said, we're speaking about $1 billion a year, even more than that, more than 44 billion since the establishment of the Israel bonds. It is a pillar of stability, whether times are good or times are bad. And we always have to be prepared, because we are in the Middle East. Again, you've been there, the forces, and nobody seems to like the State of Israel too much in the Middle East. So we always have to be prepared, and Israel bonds is part of that preparedness and part of that pillar of the establishment.
And Joe, for any of our viewers watching this programme and they'd like to financially invest in Israel bonds, what policies could they choose to invest, and what is the rate of return?
So You can buy a bond from £100. That would be a 5-year, what we call a muzzle-tov bond. It is usually purchased as a gift, either for a church, for a person, for a life cycle event like a communion or a birthday or a wedding. And those, at the moment, I believe, are giving 2%, but the rate of those will change depending on market parameters. But then, as I said, when you purchase the bond, whatever the rate is the day that is on offer is the rate that stays at for those 5 years. We have bonds, again, in dollars, sterling, and euros. We have bonds that last 1 year. We have bonds that last 15 years. We have bonds that start at £100, or we have bonds that start at $25,000. So it all depends on...
$1,000.
$25,000, yes, $25,000. It all depends on your appetite, how much you can tie up and for how long, and the interest rates reflect that. They reflect the currency, they reflect the length of time. So it's constantly moving up until the point where you purchase the bond. So that's the sort of the totality of it.
Excellent. So let's have a look at this video that looks at Israel bonds providing leadership in Israel.
What defines Israel Bonds leadership? It's about success. For decades, Bonds leaders have helped Israel realize its vast promise and potential. Every story has a beginning, and the story of Israel Bonds leadership starts with a founding conference convened by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion in September 1950. The launch of Israel Bonds was the catalyst for events across the country, enjoying support from personalities such as Albert Einstein. Bonds leadership is also about the icons of Israel: David Ben-Gurion with Jack Weiler, Moshe Dayan, being introduced by Toronto's George Cajon, Yitzhak Rabin, with Jack and Pearl Resnick and Diane Belfer, Golda Meir, who frequently conferred with Sam Rothberg, Menachem Begin, Ariel Sharon, greeted by Howard Kaplan, Jerusalem Mayor Teddy Kollek, with Canadian leaders Samuel and Sadie Bronfman, Yitzhak Shamir, with David Hermelin and Yehuda Halevi, and of course, President Shimon Peres. From the onset, Israel Bonds leaders steadfastly promoted unity. Prominent advocates for Israel have included, among others, President George W. Bush and famed investor Warren Buffett, stars from the entertainment world, including Cary Grant, Howie Mandel, Jerry Stiller and Ann Mira, Elizabeth Taylor, Josephine Baker, and Jason Alexander all demonstrated their unity. The Bonds mission found fullest expression in global partnership, with leaders from Canada, Latin America, and Europe disseminating passionate messages of solidarity and inclusiveness. Delegations to Israel have been especially gratifying for Bonds leaders, meeting its courageous defenders, expressing pride in Israel at 70, engaging in peer-to-peer interactions, and celebrating a vibrant, dynamic Jewish homeland. Delegations also mean embracing one's heritage, whether via a Jerusalem bar mitzvah like Hart Haston and Saul Volchok, or by absorbing the spirituality of the Kotel. The founders of Israel Bonds understood the importance of engaging successive generations, many of whom became prominent Bonds leaders in their own right. The enduring legacy that began with the initial Israel Bonds Conference has been collectively expressed through a shared love of Israel, a strong, proud Jewish state built with the assistance, faith, and dedication of 68 years of Israel Bonds leadership. Israel Bonds says, Todah Rabbah, thank you.
And as we saw in that video, very inspirational, knowing that you're investing in the nation of Israel, and there is only one Jewish nation, and that's Israel. Arnon, you must be very proud to be the head of Israel Bonds, knowing that you are reaching out to the rest of the world, not only Jewish communities throughout the world, but also to Christian communities who have a love and a passion for Israel and are wanting to invest their hard-earned cash in a fantastic product.
It boils down to a very simple point. Israel is my country, my father's country, my grandfather's country, my great-grandfather's country, and everybody's in Israel. It's my country. And I see things who are going on in the world today. Some deliberate, some undeliberate. I see the BDS, I see the anti-Israeli movements. I see the anti-Semitism who hides behind anti-Israeli and the other way around. And there are few ways that people around the world, Jews, Christians, friends, can show their support. And Israel Bonds is one of the main ones. And as an Israeli, it makes me proud to be able to bring this message, this thing, all across international, whether it's England and it's Europe and it's Mexico or Brazil, certainly America and Canada, which are not under my jurisdiction, but are a major part of the organization, to friends of Israel, be them who they are, just to show their support in the one, as you said, the one Jewish state, which is my country, my home. And, you know, there's nothing more important than that.
Fabulous. And Joe, what I like about Israeli Bonds is this is a very proactive way to counter the boycott, divestments and sanctions movement that want to bring about disinvestment from Israel, sanctions against Israel and boycotts against Israel. And, you know, this is a way to actually defeat them by actually having a one-to-one relationship with the state of Israel financially, isn't it?
Absolutely. There is, in the word BDS, boycott, divest and sanction, there is that word divest. And the geometric opposite of divest is to invest. And Israel Bonds is a way that someone can invest from £100. They can invest in directly to the finance ministry of the state of Israel. They can provide funds into the budget of the state of Israel, the very country that the BDS movement is trying to put down, and to repudiate that message by saying, I'm going to invest. And Israel is very grateful for investment in its tourism, its restaurants and its bars and its scenes in Tel Aviv and holidays and hotels. It's very grateful, and that needs to continue. This is just another way to put your cards on the table to say that you actually do support the state of Israel and you do say no to BDS by investing in a bond.
And in England, sorry, Joe, in England and in the rest of Europe, this investment comes with another, I would call it an added value, and Joe is being modest, because in the last year in the UK, Joe and the team has done numerous events who are content that is Israel related. And these events are for our investors, small or big, Christians or Jews, it's irrelevant. When we bring a speaker from Israel to speak either about Israel or about business or about an emotional story of a woman who is a breast cancer survivor, and then build a startup of the first time ever creating a bra for women after breast cancer, who came here as Israel Bonds guests and gave 3 talks, I would say, and made everybody very emotional with her story. This is an added content, an Israeli added content that Joe and the directors in Germany and in France and other places bring to our investors. So it's not a passive thing, like you invest £100 or $100 or whatever you want to invest and that's over with. We constantly also communicate and create content which is interesting, which is diversified, which is different, about the state of Israel and about Judaism and about emotional things, So it's an ongoing connection between the investors and Israel bonds and the State of Israel. So it's also creating a community which is much larger than a single investment.
Yeah, that's an amazing concept. I have to ask you, Joe, in terms of investing in Israel bonds, Israel's economy now is becoming one of the best in the world. It's the second #1 startup nation in the world, with so many high-tech inventions and innovations. What impact is this having on investors who want to invest in Israel bonds?
The impact is, as Arnon just told you about our community. The impact is quite wide-reaching. It depends on what people are purchasing for. If someone is looking for a investment to put in a pension, or if someone is looking for an investment to give as a gift to the next generation so that they can start teaching children how to save money. The impact is exactly what you want out of it. People will buy a bond for their own reasons. We discuss those reasons with them, so that we can understand what people want. But we're not allowed to advise people as to why they would want to purchase a bond. But we get a gauge that a lot of people are buying bonds because they want to have that bond with the State of Israel.
And going back to the BDS movement now, sadly we've seen the European Union attempt to adopt the BDS with its EU guidelines and labelling of Israeli products in Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. We see in Ireland that they tried to pass a legislation that would effectively result in a huge fine or a prison sentence anyone who would actually buy Israeli tourist goods in the old city of Jerusalem. Now, when it comes to government policy, how vital is it that supporters of Israel fight against the BDS movement?
I think it's crucial. It's not crucial for the survival of the State of Israel, thank God, because Israel is a strong, sovereign country. It is crucial because there are few ways that the supporters of the State of Israel can show their support. There are not many ways. People going to demonstrate in the streets, it's a very, very particular people who will do that, either for or against. It doesn't matter. So there are very few regular ways, let's call it, with brackets, that people can show their support. And Israel bonds is one of them. I think Joe was saying it very accurately. Investing is the way to beat the BDS. Investing in Israel bonds, investing in the State of Israel, investing in general. Investing in general is the way to beat the people who are saying, don't buy. Because at the end of the day, it's a very simple thing. Those countries, or the EU, or anyone that you mentioned, are saying, don't buy Israeli products because of X. What we're saying is just the opposite. Invest in Israel, because that's the moral thing to do. Just invest in Israel. We're not saying how much. We're not saying how big. Make a decision, a moral one. And that's the thing. There's few ways to fight it, and I think this is one of the few or the best ways of doing it, of fighting the BDS.
And Joe, when it comes to Israel, and what I've picked up from both of you as well, that it's an investment, not only investing in Israel, but in the values of Israel. So can you share with us what those Jewish Israeli values are that our viewers would be investing into? So
one of our former employees used to say that as a brokerage, we are a financial institution with a Jewish heart. That is to mean that as an investment, we don't want people to just look at this as an investment from the heart. We want people to look at this and look at the numbers, look at the rates, look at the risks and all the rewards that you would always do when you read a prospectus for any investment. Make sure that it fits within your actual program of what you want to invest in and that you're comfortable with it. But then we also want people to understand that if you're going to choose between a UK bond and an Israel bond, and you are happy with the rate of both, then maybe you'll pick the Israeli bond because of the way it makes you feel. The values of the state of Israel are very much what we believe them to be, that everyone's treated equally, everyone is worth something, that life is worth something, and that we think, we can't obviously necessarily translate that to a financial product, but the connection of Israel within the Israel bond, the bond itself is giving investors, that we've been told, that similar feeling that they would get when they think about their values and their moral system.
They say in Hebrew, sorry to disturb you, Joe, "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," which is, it's a long story of trying to summarize the whole Bible on one leg. I'm sorry for translating it very bad into English, but it's "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," which means love thy neighbor in the same way that you love yourself. And this is, when you summarizing all the values, all the values is "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha." Love thy neighbor as much as you love yourself. And I think, not as a state of Israel or a place, Judaism. Let's go one, a little bit higher than just Judaism, which love thy neighbor as much as you love yourself. And we're trying to practice it. It's not easy, but we're trying to practice it as people. We're trying to practice it as a nation. We're trying to practice it as a religion, as an origin. And for us, as an Israel Bonds, is our small way of contributing to this big effort of what is the core value that we're speaking about.
One thing I love about Israelis is not only their love of life and their appreciation for life and their kind of passion, but also the fact that only Israel would go out of a way to help our enemies. And I'll give an example of this one. A recent military operation, a poor girl from Syria went across Israel's border and she needed a kidney transplant, and there were no matches in Israel. So Israel sent out 6 or 7 elite IDF commandos deep into Syria, find a relative of this young girl, fly them to Israel, and then help with the kidney transplant. And Israel does this constantly, even in Gaza as well. And yet the mainstream media don't ever show that compassionate side of Israel. When there's an earthquake, it's always the Israelis that are the first on the scene. What is it, the makeup of Israel, that wants to change the world and make the world a better place?
Wow, that's a big question. It's a big question because I think it's listen, we are one of the oldest nations on earth. We go back, without argument, 5,000 years, but I don't want to go further than that. So we are one of the literally pillars when it comes to humanity, when it comes to people, when it comes to nations. And I think that comes, and I'm sorry for being a bit philosophical, with the responsibility. It comes with the responsibility. We're one of the first. And this responsibility is also something which, as you said, we reach out, and if somebody comes and needs help, we will help. An enemy, a friend, we will help. We'll do our best to help because of that responsibility of being there first, of being there amongst the first. I'm not going to compare to Chinese. I'm going to fight with all of them, but being there amongst the first, it comes with a responsibility. And that's what we do as Jewish people, and that's what we do as an Israeli state. And the stronger the state of Israel is, the more we're able to help. The stronger the state of Israel is, The bigger delegation we can send to Haiti, sorry, I'm a bit of a cold, to Haiti when there's an earthquake, or to Turkey, regardless of the relationship, when there's an earthquake or a fire or whatever happens. The stronger the state of Israel is, I think it's a better force in the world. And that's what we're speaking about in the end. A strong Israel, for the better of the state of Israel, for the better of the Jewish people, but also to be able to spread it around the world.
And Joe, come down to the last 2 minutes of the programme. So any of our viewers watching this programme today and been inspired by you both and want to invest in Israel by investing in Israel bonds, how can they do so? And you can speak to the camera.
Of course. The Israel Bonds has a website. It's www.israelbondsintl.com. On it, you have our phone numbers, you have our email addresses, you have ways to contact us, and you can even download forms and look at them. And we encourage people to have a look and consider us. The prospectus is also on the website, so it is important that everyone knows exactly what they're looking at when they invest in an Israel bond.
Arnon, in a minute, how vital is it that Christians invest in the state of Israel by investing in Israel bonds?
It is very important. It's very important because in the current situation in general, Israel needs its friends together with Israel. Israel needs its friends actively together with Israel. Not theoretically, not declaratively, actively together with us. Choose whatever way you want. Choose whatever way you want actively to show your support to the state of Israel. One of them might be Israel bonds. But choose the way you want to actively show your support to the state of Israel. Whatever you choose, we're good with it because you support the state of Israel.
Arnon and Joe, I just want to thank you so much for being my guests on today's Middle East Report. And you've literally inspired me. And I love the fact that you can have a connection and a bond with Israel by investing financially in Israel bonds. So thank you very much for
having us.
And I want to thank you all for watching today's programme. We've heard so much about the BDS and their lies that they spread about Israel. And now it's your opportunity to actually invest in Israel to counter the BDS. And you can do that by buying Israeli bonds. So I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.